Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me. My name is Jerome Paige, and I'm inviting you and glad you can tune in to the 1960s Project. While we're waiting for folks to join, let me describe the 1960s Project. Today's broadcast is the 8th in our series, and in this project, we'll be sharing what's on the minds of those who were in high school during the years 1960 to 1969. We'll be recalling, remembering, reflecting, and reminiscing. I want to welcome you and thank you for watching. For those who've had an opportunity to read some of the blogs and also to have looked at or viewed some of the previous Facebook Lives. The blogs are on the website, What's on Jerome's Mind, and the past lives are on YouTube. One of our themes for the 1960s Project is tiny thoughts and large memories. One of the things I found particularly exciting about the Facebook Lives and reading the blogs is that people can remember what they did on a particular day. The sun was shining when they graduated. Or they can think about the influence an event or a faculty member or a teacher had on their lives. The events going to high school. Some people found high school to be a waste of time. Others found it to be very meaningful. Today, I have three guests. They each attended Germantown High School in Philadelphia. Before I call them up, I'll give you their graduation years. One graduated in 1961. One graduated in 1963. And one graduated in 1967. I graduated from Germantown High School in 1965. So we cover the graduating classes of 1961, 1963, 1965, and 1967. So collectively, we were in high school starting in 1958 through 1967 for a 9-year period. So we cover quite a few years during the late 50s and throughout the mid 60s. So what were some of the things that were going on in 1961? Well, Barack Obama was born in 1961. When you think about it, so that he was born the year that one of our guests graduated from high school. And if you had a chance to see him over the last few days on the campaign trail, he's really has a new view, a new look. Also in 1961, a phrase that was coined and has lived since then was by the outgoing President Dwight Eisenhower. And when he was leaving office, he issued a warning about a military industrial complex developing in America. He warned us about that. Unfortunately, some of his warnings have not been heeded, and we seem to be caught up in this military industrial complex where a large percentage of the budget in the United States goes to military contractors. In 1961, James Baldwin published his Nobody Knows My Name. It was the second version of his notes of A Native Son. The Miracles had the #1 tune, Shop Around. In 1963, Kenya, country in East Africa, became an independent nation. James Baldwin also released his book of Fire Next Time. And one of the things that was significant about that book, I believe he was 39 years old at that time or close to 40. and he was writing to his 15-year-old nephew. Fast forward to a few years ago, and Ta-Nehisi Coates picks up on that theme. He's 40 years old, and he's writing to his 15-year-old son. In our book club, we read both of those simultaneously to see what advice Baldwin was giving to his 15-year-old nephew, and Coates was giving to his 15-year-old son. In '63, Martha Reeves and the Vandellas had a hit tune called Heat Wave. In '65, the year I graduated, the Voting Rights Act was signed by President Lyndon Johnson. And if you have watched on television and seen the long lines, and you've heard all the discussions about voter suppression, we can see how much the protections of the 1965 Voting Rights Act have been rolled back. The autobiography of Malcolm X was the second most popular book in 1965. And the top selling single was by the Four Tops, I Can't Help Myself. In 1967, Carl Stokes became the first black elected mayor of a major city in Cleveland, Ohio. '67 was also a year where there were significant anti-war demonstrations held across the country, people protesting America's involvement in the war in Vietnam. And Respect by Aretha Franklin was one of the top tunes of the year 1967. So let me bring up my guest. The first one is Paige Trice. And she is graduating class of 61.
62.
I'm sorry, 62. All right, my bad. I'm graduating in 61, all my promos and everything. Welcome. You've been a guest before, so welcome back.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was good to see you again. Have you reflected much about your first appearance when you were talking about your years at Germantown High School?
Well, yeah, you have me reflecting all the time, Jerome. Thank you.
Okay. And my next guest is James Paige. And let me see if I can get his graduating class correct, in 1963. Is that correct, James?
That's correct. It was 63.
Okay.
Yeah.
63. Okay.
Yeah, you done good.
And you're a returning guest as well.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of responses did you get to the first Facebook Live when you were talking about growing up in the 60s?
Well, I think, the majority of the responses was how much it sparked people's reminiscing. And
Okay.
Trigger, there's been a lot of life lived since 1963. And so there's a lot that you have to navigate back through to get to certain points in time, but it's been good. It's been good.
Okay. And our next guest is Faye Paige Edwards, and she's the class of 67. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So you'll notice that we all kind of look alike, and we all have a Paige somehow in our name. So we're 4 siblings from the Paige family. James Paige Sr. was our father, and Nanny Paige, our mother. We're 4 of 7 kids. The 4 of us were in high school in the 60s. And so we're going to talk about high school life, family life in the 60s, and anything else that might come up. So Kella.
Yes.
Okay, so you were a Paige then in '62.
Oh, yes.
How did the Pages get to Philadelphia?
The Pages, I have grown to understand from doing genealogy, they got to Philadelphia because when our father came out of the military, the decision was made to migrate to Philadelphia. But when you do the genealogy, you discover that there were Pages in the 40s already in Philadelphia. One of the realizations for me in doing the genealogy was that I always thought of our grandfather, Sam Paige, and the family being in Lynchburg. And family lore is that he moved around for work. But as I got into the genealogy, I discovered that three of he and Agnes's children were born outside of Virginia. Leroy and Lawrence were born in Washington, D.C., and Helen was born in Maryland. So they moved up and down that West Coast. I surmised that possibly his father and Sam had been in Philadelphia, but two of his aunts, well, actually three of his aunts spent time in Washington and then moved into Philadelphia. And yesterday, as I was refreshing through the genealogy, I discovered he had a brother named Bernard. Bernard was in Philadelphia in 1940. He worked for the shipyard. And then I did know that he had a cousin, Royal, what was Royal's name? I can't think of his name. But yeah, Royal Hunter. Yeah, he was a hunter. And Sam's wife, Annie, was a hunter. So Royal was Sam's cousin. Uh, they were all in Philadelphia. They were in
So they were in
Philadelphia.
they were in
They were in
Philadelphia.
Philadelphia. Yeah,
Coming, but
yeah.
the home base was what? What area was the home base?
Interestingly enough, it was Germantown.
No, I mean, when you say, well, the family migration to
Philadelphia, they migrated to Germantown. They were in the 44 zip code.
Okay, but did they migrate from what state did they migrate from?
Oh, they migrated from Virginia, from the Lynchburg, Appomattox area of Virginia.
Okay, and so we were following the Isabel Wilkerson's Warmth of Other Suns.
Yes, yeah, we were following the family. Yeah, they had made that journey. Yeah.
And so we get to Philadelphia. Where did we first live in Philadelphia?
You know, I don't remember, but I do remember Mom saying that we were in an apartment. That would have been me and James and you. Yeah. And I have no memory of the apartment.
Mm-hmm.
But then James is going to pick up. Where were we then, James? In the Richard Allen projects?
We were in the Richard Allen homes.
Oh, Richard Allen homes. Okay. When did it become the Richard Allen homes?
It's just a euphemism. It was the project.
Yeah, okay.
No, the formal name was Richard Allen Homes.
The formal name was Richard Allen Homes.
Yeah. Most of the so-called projects were called, their official name were homes. They just became known as the projects.
The projects. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, we lived right across the street from Spring Garden School.
Okay, we often refer to the Richard Allen Homes or the projects as public housing. So James, are you saying that we started out in Philadelphia in public housing?
Yes, we started out in public housing, but that was the normal migration pattern, and public housing was very different then. Most people weren't allowed to live in public housing more than 2 years. Most families, there was a limit. Like there was part of it was public housing was relatively new, so you didn't have generation after generation because we were among the first generation
in the housing. Okay, and how long did we stay at the Richard Allen Homes?
I don't remember the exact number of years, but it wasn't long because when we moved to Germantown, I just transferred from one elementary school to the next. So it wasn't like it was a significant period of time.
Okay, all right. And so why did we move from the Richard Allen Homes to Germantown?
Well, the public housing at that time had certain rules, and one of the rules was that you could not live in public housing if the head of household was self-employed. I don't remember them having any particular regulations about the amount of money that you made, but one of the stipulations was that you couldn't be self-employed. At that time, Dad worked for Mr. Prattis in a barbershop, and Mr. Prattis passed away. And I remember when he got the word that Prattis had left him to barbershop, And so we stayed in the Richard Allen homes, I guess about 6 or 8 months. I guess there was a transition period. But once it became knowledge that he was self-employed, and he actually was a business owner, they said you guys had to go.
Okay, so we come from Virginia. We end up in the Richard Allen homes,
Mm-hmm.
and then why was the decision to move to Germantown?
Well, part of that decision lied in the fact that, remember, that occurred at a time when housing was opening up, and Germantown, Mount Airy were opening up to Black folks. And the fundamental decision to move to Germantown was because much of the clientele of the barbershop had moved to Germantown. And so we were experiencing sort of a loss in clientele. When people first moved, they would always make journeys back to the barbershop. But after a while, they get old. So they found, and so basically we were following the barbershop customer base.
Okay, all right. And so we get to Germantown. What was the first stop there? What was the housing like when we first moved to Germantown?
We moved into an apartment on Upsall Street.
23 Upsall Street.
23 Upsall Street. And it was clear that was a transition move because, if I remember correctly, some of us spent some time on an air mattress. Like, it was only a 2-bedroom apartment. So, I mean, it wasn't like you carved out a whole bunch of space.
All right, so we go from Upsall Street to where?
To Baton Street, 6200 block of Baton Street.
Okay.
Dad decided to use the GI Bill and to secure a mortgage. And I didn't get the full story. This is just mostly a nosy kid listening on grown folks' conversation. So nobody ever sat there and talked to me. But the challenge for him was, as a self-employed person, to verify his income. And so that became the primary hurdle. But once that was cleared, the mortgage was secured, and then we moved into the house.
Okay, and then Faye, when we moved to the house, what are your memories of 6200 Baton Street?
Well, I was about 6 years old, and I remember my first glimpse of the house. As stated before, we lived in a little apartment building, and I thought it was like couldn't believe that we were going to live there. It was a corner property, as you guys remember, and the azaleas were in full bloom, and the light was hitting it like a movie. We walked in, and I just remember being awestruck that we were going to live in this what I thought in my 6-year-old head was the most beautiful house I'd ever seen. And it was a very nice house.
Yeah, it was. Okay. Yeah, so we were making what sounds to be like a typical migration story in the African American experience, from the South to public housing to privately owned housing. When you think about it, do you see it? You see our story in those terms as following the great arc of the movement of African Americans?
It sounds typical.
Yeah, I do. I mean, not only that, I think part of our story is the whole entrepreneurship and the seizing of opportunity. And one of the things that I always remember and has always been grateful for was how we were instructed to make a way. Like, we were never instructed to find a job. We were just instructed. Obviously, you weren't supposed to do anything illegal, immoral, or indecent. But anything, yeah. That's a long But that's one of the real learnings that always stuck with me, and one of my appreciations for being, I guess, required to work in the barbershop, because I had a barber license at 14. Like, the minute I was old enough to qualify for a barber's license, I had to take tests. So, But I do really appreciate that as a gathering point and many of the lessons that I learned from a lot of the older Black people, because part of what they shared, a lot of their sharing was their migration story.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember everything from people talking about, I remember one guy in particular talking about how he got on a bus and rode to Fisk University, and all he had was 35 cents in a bedroll. So those stories were prolific inside that environment.
Okay. Well, before we get to those stories, can we go back in time a little bit with Okella? We pick up our story in Virginia, but I know you've done some additional genealogy work. How far back can you take the Paige family, if we're talking about our father's side, or the Saunders family, if we take our mother's side?
Okay. The Paige family, we go back to our grandfather's father. So that would be our great grandfather. He too was a Sam. And recent look at genealogy, like yesterday and this morning, was the first time I ever saw our grandfather identified as a junior. But yeah, so I take him back to 1842.
Mhm.
And he was, well, he was free. His military record shows he was a body servant in the Civil War, and so his military records show that his mother was free, and so he was free. Unfortunately, he doesn't give his mother's name. But clearly, his father was a slave and his mother was a free person. So we go back to 1842 with him. And then with our mother, with the Saunders, we go back to 1846 with Wiley Saunders.
Okay. All right. So back to and what were their status? Were they free or enslaved?
Well, I have not found them free, so I have to assume they were slaves. I have not
Mm-hmm.
found them free, but we have a couple of lines, about three lines where from the beginning of my beginning to do genealogy, I find find folks free in the 40s, the 30s, and the 40s. We have a Dungy line; they were free. We have a Jones line; because the Jones were the first ones that I found free back in 1830, owning property. Yeah.
Well, we have a question. One of the questions we got from Linda was, maybe you can. Are there any stories that have been passed down from generation to generation,
Any
or
stories?
any traditions, or any?
Well, yeah. Through the Saunders line, our grandfather, John Saunders, was known as Mr. John there in Bluefield, West Virginia. And he was known as the man that could take fire out of a burn. And then our grandmother, his wife, Susie, was a
Well,
town
Ocala,
minister.
fire out of a burn? I don't know
Mm-hmm.
whether
And
those of
people
us
would.
who grew up in
What
grew
is
up,
that? What is that?
yeah. What is
No,
fire?
what?
How can you take fire out of a
How do
out
you
of a
take
burn?
fire out of a burn? Well, I actually experienced that. I lived with my grandparents the 4 years that I was in college at Bluefield State there. Prior to that, we would go back and visit when we were children. But that 4 years gave me an opportunity to ask questions that I got few answers to. But they had an oil stove in this large dining room, and somehow I walked into the stove, and I think it was my left leg and my leg, right or left leg, and it hit the edge, and it was rectangle, so you had those straight edges, and so I had a scar about 6 inches long. He came through. He was not a communicative man, and
He being your
he
grandfather.
being my grandfather, John Saunders, he didn't communicate much. But when he wanted your attention, you had to give him your attention. And he saw the burn, and he asked me to put my leg up on a chair, and he started mumbling stuff over my leg. And I'm asking, what are you saying? What are you doing? Why are you doing this? And he very quietly just kept saying, shh, shh, you don't need to know what this is. I'm taking fire out of the burn. I My leg never scarred. It never blistered. It never hurt.
Okay.
So in that community, whenever anyone got burned, they went looking for Mr. John. Later
And
in reading, I did discover that is something that comes with some of the African tribes out of Africa, and is something in those, is one of the things within those, in certain tribes, where they hand that down generationally. He didn't want to share that with me, but I became aware of it and have done some reading on it. Yeah.
and you were about to mention our grandmother, Susie.
Yeah, Susie was one of 2 or 3 town midwives, and she kept sterile sheets. She always knew when women were pregnant. She knew when they were ready to deliver, and she would take off with her sheets and whatever she needed, and she would deliver the babies.
Okay. Well, let me ask you one other question related to genealogy, but it's the genetic tracing. Have
Mhm.
you what information can you share about our genetic ancestry?
Okay, well, for the Saunders, we go back to the crew, or the name prior to crew was the Vey, and they're in Liberia.
Mhm.
And the Pages go back to let's see, where do my Pages go? Where's Sam? Hey, they go back to the Hausa in Nigeria.
Mhm. There's a graphic up on the screen.
Yeah.
So we have the siblings, there's 7 of us in the sibling. And then on the right hand, facing the screen where it says father, and then his grandfather, they go back to the house of people in Nigeria.
In Nigeria, right.
And then on our mother's side, our grandmother, they go back to the Fulbe and house of people in Nigeria.
Right.
So, and we also have my mother's grandfather who was with the crew people in Liberia.
Right.
And our father's grandmother with the Yoruba people in Nigeria. So we're a mixture of Nigerian and crew out of Liberia. Now you had a more recent find just about a month ago.
That was our grandmother Susie Palmer Saunders. Her father, who was one of several lines of Jerry Palmers, and I traced them back to Shadrach Palmer. And we have a Palmer cousin that agreed to take the African ancestry test, and we traced back to Gabon.
Okay. So we've got some African roots via Virginia through the Richard Allen Holmes. And where are you now, Keller? What part of the world do you live in?
I've been in Los Angeles, California for 50 years.
Okay, and James, what part of the world do you live in?
I'm still in Philadelphia.
Okay, and Faye, what part of the world are you?
I live in downtown St. Louis, but at the moment I'm in Myrtle Beach.
Okay, all right. Taking a Corona vacation?
Corona vacation.
Very good, very good. Well, James, you were talking about making your own way, and Skip Douglas, who was listening in, said that you used to cut his hair. You remember Skip Douglas?
I remember Skip Douglas. I saw his comment. Hello, Skip.
Now, so in our family, when I was thinking that like this, at one point I just thought about it in this term of series. We were an enterprise. It was Paige's Takeout, Paige's Corner Store, and Paige's Barbershop.
Yeah.
Right. And James, you said you got a barber's license at 14. I cut hair, but I never got a license. I just
you just cut it.
That's what we did.
You were part of the illegal branch. So.
Oh, okay. I was part of the illegal branch. Well,
Barbara and I cut hair, and we never got a license. We cut hair.
Oh, I didn't remember that. I only remember James and I cutting hair.
Well, we didn't cut hair I didn't cut hair when I was at 6200 Baton Street. Okay. When I moved away and got married, I started cutting my husband's hair.
Oh, okay.
It's in the DNA.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when I was at Howard University.
He went out to the barber one day and came back, and I said, I know I can do a better job than that. And that was a mistake. Then I cut his hair for a long period of time. Then I had to stop, but yeah.
Yeah, when I was at Howard University as an undergraduate and was living in a dorm, that's how I made extra money. I would set up shop in the area where you took showers and the sinks were, and I cut hair. That was my spending change. And so Faye, what do you remember about the Paige businesses, barbershop?
Well, mostly Paige's
Takeout.
That was started out as an ice cream shop and segued into sandwiches. We were known for our hoagies and our cheesesteaks, and we, very small groceries until we opened the store. But mostly, what I remember about Paige's Takeout is that I hated it.
You didn't hate
so lucky, you have a store, and I'd be in the back crying, peeling those onions praying, Lord, take me away from these people. So that's what I remember.
Faye, where was it located? Where was the barbershop?
It was on Germantown Avenue near Duval Street. So the barbershop, Paige's Takeout, and then what would become the corner store were actually almost beside each other. We kind of moved from property to property. And recently, when I was at home, we were walking, my sister and I were out walking, and we went in to a new restaurant. And so we said, oh, my father used to own this building, and Black people own it now. And he said, your father didn't own this. We bought this from Koreans. And then we had to explain to him that when Koreans came into the block, that it was a thriving block with lots of Black businesses. I think maybe all the businesses, maybe except for the hardware store. No, the hardware
except
store.
For the antique shop.
Except for the antique. But it was so interesting that he challenged me right away and said, why are you making up that story? So it was interesting to revisit the properties and to see now how they are coming back into the hands of Black businesses.
Oh, that's good. So James, did you cut hair? Did you work at a takeout too?
Oh yeah. I did it all. At some point or the other. My role at the takeout was more, I think I was working somewhere else. My role was more coming in. I remember doing repairs, moving electric lines, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I was always the family handyman. So.
All right. Okay. And what about the corner? What was it? What was in the corner? What was the merchandise in the corner store?
Originally, I owned the corner store. It was a health and beauty aid store. That was my first segue into retail.
I did not know that.
Mm-hmm. And when Dad decided that he and I was moving on to owning the larger deli up on Oaklands Avenue, and he decided that he didn't want the rigors of the takeout anymore, and so we basically worked out just a transfer deal. And initially, the Winds owned that property. I don't know if you remember Margaret and Ingrid.
I do. Mm-hmm.
Because that was originally a paint store.
Yes, it was.
That's right. I remember that now.
And at one point, we had made an attempt, when Will decided to give up the paint store, we had made an attempt to basically become involved in paint, but that didn't work out well, primarily because a paint store is not a retail business as it existed then. You either had connections with contractors or you didn't make any money. So that was, but you mentioned all of the businesses. Remember there was a hardware store owned by Black folks.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And we were also there when Charlie Gray opened the Rib Crib.
Rib Crib, yeah.
Which became the best of for Philadelphia Magazine a couple of years.
I think the Cleaners was Black owned also.
The Cleaners was Black owned. In fact, that was Chubby Checker's mom.
Yes.
Miss Evans.
Miss Evans.
Right.
The
cleaner. Mm-hmm. I'm beginning to visualize the spaces. But it was also the bike shop, the Nickens bike shop. Right?
Nickens bike shop. Yeah.
And also prior to Nickens, there was a TV repair shop, and it was owned by this brother. I don't remember his name, but he had enough business acumen that he listed his TV repair shop as Aaron's TV repair so that he would be first in the Yellow Pages.
Wow.
The
Okay.
Yellow Pages.
Because I was I remember having that conversation with him because we were in there just talking, and he picked up the phone and he said, Aaron's TV repair. And I said, your name's not Aaron. I don't remember his name.
Yeah.
No, and then that's when he went on to explain his marketing acumen. So,
Okay.
And,
well, we have all these businesses, Paige's Barbershop, Paige's Takeout, Paige's Corner Store. Did you do anything other than work?
No.
Didn't feel like it.
Didn't feel like it.
Well,
we worked.
Faye, did you what did you do for fun?
I always thought I was having a fun deficit. And I thought that everybody was having way more fun than me.
Well, what kind of fun were those people having?
Oh, they were going to parties and they were dating and they were hanging out at various places. And on Friday and Saturday night, I was peeling onions for the hoagies.
Did you ever go out? Did you ever party?
At the time, as your teenage brain, when I look back, I did go out. I would never have been classified as a partier, being at every party, but I went out often enough, and I dated. But maybe it was like looking on Facebook, where it looks like everybody's having more fun than you. But that's clearly how I felt, during the time. But I went out. Looking back, I had plenty of friends. And what teenagers do, you hang out, you party. But it was.
What about neighborhood fun? Was there any people, quote unquote, that you played with or hung out with in the neighborhood?
Well, actually, our block, I remember as being the fun block. It was a place where people gathered from many blocks. They would come to our block to.
And our block, again, is the 6200 block of Baden Street.
Baden and Tappahannock Street. I can't speak for you, but for me, I wasn't allowed really to leave the block. That's part of me feeling I had a fun deficit. Other people were allowed to roam the neighborhood, but
we were not.
Stay on the block. But our home, as well as the block, was a gathering place. Everyone came there to play games, to stop by. And that was something that I feel our parents cultivated because they didn't want me out roaming around. So they knew I had wanderlust in my eyes. I remember it being, playing games in the street. I had a pretty good double dutch. I remember that the boys and the girls games were pretty much separate. But occasionally you guys would let me do something called running bases. And I just always remember being so honored. I had no idea what running bases was. But at times, if you guys were playing, because I was your little sister, you would let me run. And I think the bases were just like across the street and back. That's where we played. So I remember it being, at night, the stereotypical thing when the parents start and the street lights come on and people start calling people to come home, they would leave our block and go. And then we, of course, would migrate to the steps, which is where we were supposed to stay.
Okay. Well, you talk about the takeout, James, and the barbershop, but I remember you holding all kinds of jobs.
Oh, yeah.
Can you remember kind of the jobs you've had in addition to the family enterprises?
We don't have enough time. No, I didn't go straight to college.
No, I meant growing up.
Well, yeah, I sold Jet magazine.
You're a paper boy.
I delivered papers.
What I remember is that you guys in the old days, just like in the 1900s, you had these bags full of papers. It would be like papers were on both arms and your back and your head, and then you physically walked and threw the paper.
through the paper.
That really dates y'all.
Yeah, the big thing was moving up from carrying those to getting a wagon. That was
Yeah.
that was the
And actually, I remember shifting from the bag to the belt because there was a belt that the guy gave me, which made it easier to deal with the papers. I don't remember how long the route was. I don't remember any of that. I do know that every Friday there was an envelope where I picked up the papers for $13.50, and that was real money.
Yeah.
You carried Inquirers. I was a bulletin guy. You were the morning newspaper guy. I was the afternoon.
And that was really the experience that taught me how seasons change. Because I started off in the winter, and so I would start my route in the dark. And then as the seasons changed, it got to the point where even though I was doing the same 6 o'clock or whatever it was light outside. So.
Oh, okay, good. So we have 6200 Baton Street as a base. We have the 6300 block of Germantown, the 6200 block of Baton Street as a housing or home base. We have the 6300 block of Germantown Avenue as a business base. But there's also Grace Baptist Church. What are some of your memories about what role did Grace Baptist Church play in our development?
Well, I think we were kind of famous at church because of our parents, not because of anything we did. I guess we were outstanding Christians. Who knows? But Dad was the church treasurer and a very successful Bible study leader. And when I think of my mother, she was queen of the courtesy club. They used to welcome the visitors. And she was also the queen of the Sunday school and a vacation Bible school. So based on that, we just kind of had a status, I think, in the church that had very little to do with what we did, although we were there all the time and participating all the time. And I think that's where we learned our public speaking, because we were in every play, every Easter program. It was not complete unless the Pages were in it. And that was true.
What do you remember, O'Keller?
Oh, I remember. Well, we go to Germantown as I'm a preteen. So I start to have my own quiet feud, and I didn't necessarily like the aspect of having to be in church all day on Sunday. I resented the fact that we lived on Baton Street, which was not far, but blocks from Sharpneck Street, where the church were and where other members of the church lived. And back then, you met in people's homes. And whenever we would host, everybody would grouse about having to come down to the 6200 block of Baton Street. Yet we would go all the time, go north. And I would say, I don't understand.
We first started going to church. The church was located on what street?
Sharpneck Street.
Okay.
Sharpneck, right off of Germantown Avenue. It was technically a one-room church. It did have a little balcony where the choir changed their robes, and they would hold some Sunday school class or something, or they would hold meetings. And the benches were lacquered, and in the summertime, if you didn't take care, you'd stick to the bench. You'd stick to the bench. You learned to carry something to protect you from sticking to the bench. But yes, we stayed extremely busy, and I remember I was the holdout for joining Grace. Everybody kept saying, "When are you joining? When are you joining?" And I had enough information to know. My response would be, I thought this was an individual choice. But eventually I did.
So a little pressure on you to join?
The pressure was put on because the parents had joined, all the rest of you had joined, and I was just the holdout. But I did join, and I am glad I did, because like Faye shared, it became the platform of so many African Americans of that time. We did learn to speak. We did learn to Robert's Rules of Order. We did learn how how to have a meeting. We learned, we became secretaries and learned how to take minutes. So that was very much a part of us. So as I left Philadelphia, married and came west, one of the things I was greeted with all the time was, you can't be from here. You speak so well. And my response there would be, but everyone I know speaks like I speak. And I guess it was because we were reared in the Black church. We were required to know how to enunciate, project, not get up before people with a raggedy piece of paper. You had to know your lines. And I brought that with me to California with my husband and eventually my daughters, and got involved in church. And I was just absolutely appalled at what I found in terms of education and what was going on in the church. So I forged my way and had spent some time in the Methodist church here for a while. Went out to the valley and learned that the white churches were doing theater in the church, and built on what I knew from a child at Grace Baptist Church. And we had several years of theater in the church, which nobody understood initially. But now, whenever I go back and visit those churches, everybody starts to reminisce about crimes.
What do you remember about church?
Going. Being in church all the time.
All day.
A lot of activities. Bible, BTU, Baptist
BTU.
Training Union. That was the summer church was called. What was the summer church called?
Vacation Bible School.
Vacation Bible School. Yeah, I remember all those activities. The Scouts, Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts. Those were activities we were engaged in. And we were all on the trip to Ghana together last year. I had a Grace Baptist moment when we were in Ghana at the last bath, or the Aswan River. And like many on that trip, when you hear the stories about the captured Ghanaians and others from surrounding areas being marched up to maybe as many 300 miles to the port to be loaded onto the slave ships, they had to take the last bath, and that was called. They would take their last bath before they got onto the slave ships. And so part of the return visit, and I felt when I was there hearing the story, I felt compelled to wade in the water a little bit and rebaptize myself. And I could remember being baptized at Grace Baptist Church at that moment, and it's as if I was being rebaptized again. So that was a powerful moment there. We haven't talked much about high school, Germantown High School, and we don't have a lot of time. But Okella, you submitted a blog which talks about your experience at Germantown, and James, you submitted a blog. So if people want to look at those blogs, they have an opportunity to read those by going to the website or to Facebook. But what about some of the social protests of the time? I mean, I can remember many groups protesting against segregation, specifically Cecil B. Moore and his struggles against getting facilities desegregated. Particularly, I remember the Girard College demonstrations. Girard College was this private institution with these big walls up that surrounded it. And the metaphor was that Cecil B. Moore, they were going to walk around those walls until they fell down.
Oh, man.
And eventually they did were able to do that. And Cecil B. Moore was very active, so much so that eventually Columbia Avenue was renamed Cecil B. Moore Avenue. Was that?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. What other social protests do you remember growing up?
I remember watching the March on Washington and wondering why we weren't there, because we really weren't an activist family in my estimation. However, we always were very immersed in Black history and Black pride. And I remember thinking we should be there, and we weren't.
Mm-hmm. O'Keller or James, you have
Well,
any?
I one of the things that has come to mind with me, particularly since we were at Grace Baptist under Jeremiah Wright Senior, and so we grew up with Jeremiah Junior. He talks a lot when you hear him about being a part of demonstrations there down on Shelton Avenue.
Oh yeah, I remember
I
those. Yeah.
don't remember any of that, but then I remember I was away. But I do remember a number of the things around Leon Sullivan.
Yes. Oh, I see. Zion Baptist Church.
I remember a lot about that, and know that that's still thriving there in Philadelphia. So he's still well known and remembered and appreciated for what was done through his name around OIC.
Well, listen, we only have a few minutes left. We've been spending almost an hour reminiscing. What has come to mind to you spending this time thinking back? Has any new thoughts come, or any new appreciations, any new insights you got from the discussion? What was conjured up?
Well, anytime we have these discussions, it always, and I'm sure this is not specific to me, but in our family, but it's always amazing when you look at how people can grow up in the same environment, have the same parents, have the same influences, like you mentioned, the church and various things, and just be so very different. And one of the things that I do appreciate coming from a large family is that we always were able to honor differences. Everybody was a whack job. We got that. So, but that was okay,
I guess go ahead.
And just really the blessings of it all. I mean, this is sometimes your experience sort of disconnects you, but here we have 7 siblings. Nobody ever spent any real time in jail. I mean, I got locked up a couple times, but it wasn't.
You were saved. You were saved by the grace of your daddy. The policeman knew him. Paige, take your friends and go home.
But when you think about, nobody ever really got strung out on drugs, or we never really had that sort of family trauma. I don't know if it's a reminiscing, but I do stand in gratitude for that.
What, O'Keller?
Well, one of the my reflection is that I recognized early that our mother intentionally tried to help us understand the benefit of family, and she would not allow us to be ugly with each other. She would not allow us, and she'd say, you may have your moments with your sisters and brothers, but they are your sisters and brothers. And then I saw the example in her and our father, with each of them falling like in the middle. All of their siblings visited us. We were not always allowed to visit other family members, but all of them could come visit us. Right. And they had to adhere to whatever Nan's rules were.
Well, we probably go ahead. Go ahead. Finish that spot.
No, so what I saw through my parents was how all of their siblings loved and honored them.
Okay.
So so that was demonstrated on the regular for us.
Right.
And all their siblings came through all the time, to the point where I was always incensed that there was always somebody else around. But
I got an email or a Facebook from Willie Gaspy. Is it Willie Gaspy?
Glaspie.
Yeah, he noted that 6200 Baden Street was his home as well.
Yeah.
And I remember him visiting as well. We probably should give a shout out to the other 3 siblings. Who wants to shout out them?
The second three.
I'll shout out to Sue.
Because you were the bridge.
Yeah, you were the bridge.
I was the bridge. I was the youngest of these 4, and the oldest, the middle child, the best, the most well-adjusted. My sister Susie, who is about 7 years younger than me, who lives in Philadelphia, And then we have Barbara, who lives in Houston, Texas. And then we have everyone's favorite baby sister, Kathy, who lives in Delaware, right outside of Philly. So she's in and out of the Philadelphia home where my mother lives now as well. And that makes up the 7 Paige children. And we are known collectively as having epic family gatherings. Everyone wants to come to our house for Thanksgiving and for Christmas. And we just want you all to know y'all are all welcome.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much. Okella is the oldest. She's number 1. Thank you. James is number 2. And Jerome is number 3. And Faye is number 4. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This broadcast, my name is Jerome Paige. This broadcast was the 8th of our 1960s project. Hope you get a chance to read some of the blogs and watch some of the previous lives. We've been talking about growing up in Philadelphia for those of us who were in high school in the 60s. And so I'd like to invite you again to read the post, watch the Facebook Lives. And we're here every Tuesday at 5 p.m. We'd like to think about, and this was an example of having tiny thoughts and large memories.
Nice. Yes.
Nice.
Thank you very much, and everyone have a good evening.
Good night.
Bye, Sibs.